Welcome back to day 4 of Personal Power. Hey, I want to congratulate you on your commitment and keeping it to follow through each and every day and build one success on the day before. It's this kind of simple daily input that creates the chains of positive success programming instead of the old conditioning that may have controlled some of your success or failure in the past. So let's get started. Obviously, you've already done your exercise. I don't even have to bring that up anymore, do I? Well, good. Today, what we're going to study is what is and how to use neuroassociative conditioning, step by step. Now, this science of neuroassociative conditioning, or knack as I call it, the metaphor I use is giving you the knack of taking control of your life. I developed this science out of frustration, quite honestly. You see, for many years, I've been considered to be one of the top experts in the science of neuro-linguistic programming. And that was a science that I originally studied with its co-founder. I didn't develop it, but I really mastered what he taught. And I was incredibly impressed by the work. It allowed me to make changes in people with lightning-like speed, changes that for years they've been trying to make in their own life but have been unable to do. In fact, I became rather famous in a short period of time by getting on national television and basically challenging other therapists, saying, bring me your worst patient, give me somebody that you have difficulty with, or give me somebody out of your audience right now that's got a lifetime problem, maybe a phobia, for example, and I'll eliminate that problem right here on television over the next 30 minutes. And it wasn't a magic bullet. It didn't work in every case, but fortunately, it worked every time I was on TV, and that really helps. But the bottom line is I got frustrated where it didn't work. I began to wonder, okay, why isn't it working in this situation? Because I was looking for the cure-all, if you will. And I also noticed something else that bothered me about NLP, and that was that a large number of the people that were involved in it became almost, it became almost like a religion, where it was like that was the only answer. And I wasn't for that because I could look around and see that every kind of therapy works. I don't care what it is you want to change in your life. You always want to change one of two things. You either want to change how you feel about things, or you want to change your behavior. You say, no, Tony, no, that's not what I want. I want to change my money situation. Well, the only way you're going to change your money situation is by changing the way you feel and the way you behave. Does that make sense? So I've noticed that I don't care what the problem is, whether someone was raped, they've had a tremendous fear trauma growing up, it was a situation where they were physically harmed, something they were emotionally harmed, it was a bad set of habits. I don't care what it is you want to change in your life. You got a poor relationship with your mother or father. Every form of therapy works some of the time. So rather than making all the therapies wrong, I find out what really did they all have in common that made them successful when they were successful. And then once I discovered that common element, how could we make that happen more rapidly and with less pain? Those are my criteria for success. So let's take a problem. Let's say, for example, you had a problem with your father and you felt like you're overwhelmed by them, like he controlled you and you can't express yourself because you are always in a subservient position. And now you live that way in your daily life and you see it doesn't work because it doesn't allow you to express your feelings. You don't go for it 100%, you feel shut down. How would you deal with that? Well, there are a zillion ways using various types of therapies. Let's take a look. We've already said that what we do is based on what we associate to things. So again, if you associate expressing your opinion is going to equal pain, you're not going to do it. So what is the therapist's job? Get you to associate that expressing yourself could mean pleasure and not pain. That not expressing yourself would mean pain. What are the various ways of going about that? Well, one would be to use Gestalt therapy. In Gestalt therapy, what would you do? Well, they would take you in and the therapist would understand that a lot of the frustration and challenges in your life come from your beliefs about your relationship with your father and what you can and can't do. So what would this good Gestalt therapist do? Highly likely they'd pull out a chair and they'd say, see this chair? This is your dad. You got to change how you feel about him and realize you're in power. What he'll tell you is, I want you to scream and yell, let him know how you really feel. Let him know that you're in charge. Let him have it. And so you go, well, Dad, I don't feel like you gave me enough space to communicate. And they go, no, express how you really feel. Let it out there. Yeah. And sure enough, finally you make you emotional enough. You're going, Dad, I'm in charge. I'm a big person now. And you know what? As silly as this sounds, it works. If you really think that chair for a moment, if in your head you associate that's your dad and you feel strong, there's your dad and you feel strong, and there's your dad and you feel strong, for the first time in your life, when you think of your dad, you may feel strong, be able to express yourself clearly. So it does work, as silly as it may sound. Now, obviously, this is a generalization about Gestalt, but it gives you a good picture. Now, let's try another form of therapy. Let's say I got the same problem, but you go to rational emotive therapy. There, a competent therapist is going to teach you that your frustration is not having anything to do with your boss or your dad or your brother or your sister, but specifically it's not your dad. It's caused by your own irrational beliefs about your dad. Now you have the pain of feeling stupid for believing all this crazy stuff, and it's also making you suffer a little bit. And so your brain finally says, I don't want that pain. And he says, look, if you just change your beliefs, you could feel better. And through this conversation, if you trust the therapist and if they're competent enough, pretty soon you may change what you associate to your relationship with your dad. Sure enough, your behavior changes again. But notice what has changed when it works, because it doesn't always work. The neuroassociation has changed. That's when the therapy works. When you now have a new meaning for what being with your dad means. You have a new meaning for relationship. Let's try another approach. Let's say you try Rogerian counseling. There, the therapist listens and reflects back what you say about yourself with your father, with unconditional positive regard with you and without any judgment for you. He or she will tell you that you have the resources within yourself to solve the problem. And what they'll do is create a place for you to feel very, very appreciated and loved, hold you in a very strong and respected light. And as you feel better about yourself and you talk about this, you have kind of reputation to live up to. And as a result, pretty soon you may begin to change your associations in your mind about who you are and what that relationship really is. As a result, bam-o, all of a sudden the change you wanted has happened. You feel freed. Now you can go out and communicate and be who you are. Again, simple approach. Let's say you got the same problem. You want to go for Freudian therapy, or as we call it, non-directive therapy. There what happens is you lie on a couch and talk to yourself for about 4 or 5 years. I'm being only slightly exaggerating here. And what happens, though, is that you say things, you ask questions, and all they do is reflect them back to you, get you to think about them. And by reevaluating your life in so many different details, and you're feeling different now than you did then, eventually, hopefully, you make new neuroassociations. Although there's no guarantee in this therapy because the therapist is not to direct you. That's what non-directive therapy means. The only challenge I have with it is how long it takes. What's step 2? I simply interrupt their present limiting associations, their limiting pattern of association. So, for example, somebody's got a phobia, and what happens? Right now, when they see an elevator or even think of one, they have a patterned way of responding. They have an immediate association, and that association is elevator equals ultimate pain, and immediately their body freaks out. So what do? Well, I first got them to leverage so that I know they're going to change and I know they're committed to it. And then I do whatever it takes to change that association, to interrupt that pattern. So the minute they start thinking about, let's say, this elevator and they start to freak out, all of a sudden I reach over and I say, stand up. And they go, huh? And I say, stand up. And right at that moment, it interrupts their pattern. And I say, okay, sit down. They sit back down again. And I say, well, tell me about this elevator thing. And they go, huh? And sure enough, they start to go into the thing again. And all of a sudden I ask them a question. Let me ask you a question. Right in the middle of them thinking about the elevator. Would you eat a bowl of live crickets for $40,000? Instantly, what happens? Their brain goes, what? And again, I've interrupted the pattern. I'll do all kinds of things. The key to interrupting somebody's pattern is you want to do something they don't expect, something that will jolt them. It's kind of like, have you ever been so caught up in a conversation that you were like totally immersed in it? And then somebody came by, stood right next to you, asked you a question, and had nothing to do with what you were talking about. In order to answer them, you went over here and answered them, and you came back and you couldn't remember what you were talking about? Have you ever had that happen? Even when you were like real committed to talking about this particular thing, what it did is that person interrupted your pattern and it was hard for you to get back to it. I mean, think of it this way. If you interrupt somebody's pattern enough, eventually they can't ever get back to it. Think of your mind as being like a jukebox. And in that jukebox, you have a zillion little records. And these records, at any moment in time, you can play any one of them. And depending upon which one you play will determine how you feel. So if you played a sad song record, you're going to feel lousy. If you play a positive record, you're going to feel really great. The challenge is, for a lot of us in life, something happens and it like pushes our buttons, and instantly we start playing one of these records, one that makes us feel sad or feels frustrated or feels angry. And what we've got to learn to do, though, is interrupt those patterns, to change those records. What would happen if I took a record out of your brain, a memory, if you would, or a pattern, and I took that record and I just started scribbling across it? I took a knife and went across it, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. You'll never be able to play that record the same way again. That's called interrupting somebody's pattern. I'll give you another simple example. I was doing a seminar one time, and this woman came up to me. We had just done a session, it was pretty powerful, on relationships. And she came up to me and she said, Mr. Robbins, she said, I've got this problem with my husband and I, and she began to cry like crazy. Now, I really care about people very deeply. So initially, in the early days of my really working with people, I would immediately say, hey, please relax. It's okay. Please don't worry. Whatever it is, we'll work it out. But you know what the problem with that is? That's what everybody does. So rarely does that interrupt somebody's pattern. In other words, they expect you to say it's okay, and it doesn't usually change the pattern. They go, well, yeah, I guess you're right, and then they go and run the pattern again. Does that sound familiar? So what I now learn to do is jolt people, to literally interrupt their pattern so they can't get back into it, to change their neuroassociation radically. And I do it in some pretty outrageous ways. So she comes up and says, Mr. Robbins, my husband and I, we go, and she starts to cry, and I was drinking a glass of water. So I took the glass and went, shh, and I dumped this water on her. She jumped about 4 feet. She said, what are you, crazy? What are you doing? I said, oh, nothing. And I just smiled. And I said, tell me about you and your husband. And she said, what? And now she's laughing while she thinks about her husband and herself. Ah, whole new pattern. And she goes, what are you talking about? I said, well, tell me about you and your husband. And I smile, and I drink a little more of my water. She goes, you're a little crazy. I said, well, that's true, but go ahead and tell me. So she thinks for a few moments, and she goes, well, my husband and I, and all of a sudden she's fine about it. Well, we've been having some problems. And I said, but no, you were crying before. Remember, you were crying. And I tried to get her back there, and she said, oh, yeah, well, that's because of that. She started crying again. I took my one, shh. I nailed her again. I mean, this time her makeup is kind of dripping, right? There are people standing around. Now, by the way, you shouldn't try this unless you've got some strong rapport skills as well, right? And got a strong connection. But she knew I cared, even though I seemed a little crazy. And she started laughing. She goes, what are you doing? That's crazy. And she's dripping the stuff off her face. I said, nothing. Just tell me about you and your husband. She says, oh, we're fine. I said, no, come on, tell me. I got to tell me one more time. Well, a little bit more water. After that, anytime she thought about her husband, she started to crack up. She said, we're absolutely fine. That's called leverage and interrupting somebody's pattern. The water was the leverage, and the pattern interrupt happened over and over again until pretty soon she couldn't play it again. When she thought about her husband, she started to laugh. And out of laughter, she was able to come up with some better solutions on her own. She wasn't stuck in the pattern. Does that make sense? We've got to interrupt our pattern to create new results. And that's exactly what this is about. For right now, though, let's start to use this at least. Let's begin to get some leverage on ourselves, interrupt our patterns, and create some new associations. Let's start with an assignment. Please pull out your journal right now. And let's start out by taking those 4 things you wanted to change, 4 things that you should be doing but you weren't following through on. And let's make sure that you really make these things happen. How? Let's get some major leverage on ourselves. Right now, I want you to write down 10 reasons for each one of these 4, 10 reasons why you absolutely must make this happen now. And make sure that the musts include what it'll cost you if you don't, and all the great stuff you'll get by doing them. And we kind of started this process, but let's really hone it in so you feel major leverage that this is something that must change, you must change it, and you can change it and will right now. Write down why you know you absolutely can change this. In other words, make sure that that first step of leverage is absolutely handled. Second assignment, I want you to make sure that you interrupt your own pattern. And the way you're going to do that is I want you to write 4 or 5 ways that you can interrupt your negative patterns. So for example, if you overeat, I want you to make one of your assignments to go to a gathering and not eat anything. Go to lunch with someone, have a social meeting, have a conversation, and experience the pleasure of being at a meal without having to eat to get the pleasure. Or let's say you're in the middle of an argument. And right in the middle of the argument, you have a pattern interrupt now that you've designed for yourself, which says you're going to grab your nose and make a silly noise like whoop, whoop, whoop. Something totally absurd. That when you're in the middle of it, the way you're going to get yourself out, you're going to reach up and go whoop, whoop, whoop. And you've got a way to interrupt that pattern massively. It'll also interrupt the pattern of the people around you. In the middle of you arguing like this, also you reach up your nose and go whoop, whoop, whoop. That will definitely change their state. They'll be wondering what's wrong with you, but they'll also begin to laugh and you'll get caught out of the pattern. You won't get stuck. For example, have you ever been so caught up in a pattern of arguing, for example, you forgot what you're arguing for, but you knew you had to win? Well, this is the way to get out of it. Interrupt the pattern. Do something hysterical, do something weird, do something funny, but specifically, right now, make a list of 4 or 5 pattern interrupts you could do. You might want to create some of these for your relationships. The more you can do that, interrupt your own patterns, the more power you have over yourself. Here's the 3rd assignment on this exercise. Create a new association to the change you want. In other words, whatever change you want to make happen, make sure you link tons of pleasure. And one way to do that is just think about all the things you're going to gain in your life and feel the gains. All the things that are going to be more pleasurable, all things that will be better by you making these changes. And do it over and over again by repetition. So whenever you think of it, you think of all the great things you're going to get. As a result, that new association will stay and things will change. So the assignment is, first get leverage on yourself. Write down 10 reasons why you absolutely must change this behavior or action. Also write all the reasons why you know absolutely that you can do it. Number 2, Design 4 or 5 ways to interrupt your patterns, 4 or 5 ways to get yourself out of a limiting association. And then thirdly, over and over again, condition yourself. Think about things over and over again. Feel them and think about them until you have a new association that gets you to follow through, and it's effortless, where you want to do it consistently, where you feel compelled and driven. Have some fun with this. I know it's new. So was riding a bicycle at one time, and you may have fallen off in the beginning, but you didn't go, oh, I'm a failure. You just got up and did it again. So if this feels a little awkward at first, that's okay. Just go for it. And as we do it over and over again, you're going to get good at it where you don't even have to think about it. You can just produce the result. Go to work or to play, if you will. I'll see you in the next tape tomorrow. Live with passion.